The grand finale. In the coming 45 minutes, we want to summarize the day's proceedings. I'd like to introduce you to the panelists to this end. Peter Schaar has already been introduced. He is the Data Protection Officer. Then Dr. Günther Wösch. He's an IT expert and head of the department from the Ministry of the Interior, which is responsible for security issues. No, I'm responsible for security in IT. Dr. Wieland Hohlfelder, we heard from him this morning. He's engineering director and site lead of Google Germany. And Thomas Ramge, technology correspondent of the business magazine Brand 1 and freelance author for The Economist, author of books, and so on and so forth. Now, we have asked our panelists to begin by making a brief statement on the following issue. Are the targets of sparing resource of data and efficiency of use, or do they complement each other? Mr. Schaar, would you like to begin? Right. Well, I don't see any contradiction there. On the contrary, so what is not available cannot be abused. And therefore, I would say the greater the data volumes are, the more sensitive the data are that are stored, the greater, at least the risk is, in principle at least, that they may get out of control and that there may be considerable damage that ensues. So I would say no, there is no contradiction. The two aspects fit very well together. Okay, let me respond if I may. I think we're talking about data privacy and data protection. Compare the two or review them, then basically these are two sides of one and the same coin. There is no data protection without data privacy. If you ask users, of course, this is generally the first answer that you get, that security of their data is very important to them, and they're concerned that this should be guaranteed. Of course, you can say if there are no data, you don't need to protect them. But of course, that just has nothing to do with the realities of life. So therefore, it's of the utmost importance. And the best data protection regulations and the strictest implementation of these rules are ultimately of no use if unauthorized third parties have access to the data or the data get lost. So this is something that must be given the utmost priority. And of course, there are a whole number of other issues that we cannot afford to ignore either. The fact is that the internet is such an important and useful platform for us all when it comes to freedom of information, so on and so forth, business activity, etc., etc. And this, of course, has to do with the fact that it's been made as safe as it is at the present moment in time. And the security does not come about by accident. It has to do with the fact that we can ward off attacks, and these attacks can only be warded off if we have understood what are regular and irregular modes of access. And to do that, we need to look and see what regular attacks look like, or what does a high-quality page look like that may perhaps occur in our index. And once we've done that, we can filter out the bad things. And we said we wanted to point out what is important to us. 3 points. Data security is extremely important because these cyber attacks, not sure Mr. Wösch can say more about this, are there in place and constitute a permanent threat to the freedom of the internet. There are spotnets, there's spam, there are viruses, there are all sorts of different harmful software that pose a threat to the internet as a whole. We have to become active in this respect. It's extremely attractive in financial terms. There are a few risks for the people who are launching the attacks because they are launching these attacks from a long way away. There's no risk of them being caught in situ. Therefore, the most important thing for us is that we can say to our users that data security is of paramount importance, and that we should do what is important for the users as a company, in our case, but also as an association of all companies that are active on the net in one way or another, we must guarantee the security of the data of our users and the traffic data as well. That must be given priority. And if we are limited in this respect in our use of these data, then there is a conflict between sparing use of data and data protection. Mr. Vesch, what's your view on this issue? Well, that's quite true, of course, that you can end up in a conflict here if we are indeed talking about looking at the security of an entire system, and then over and above that, the security of the data that are used within that system. There's no doubt about that. But if we then come back to a primary question, as the sparing use of data and data security, are they going to end up in a conflict? I would say no. I would go along with Mr. Schaar completely, because ultimately, as regards this measure, we're talking about sparing use being an economic matter on both sides, whereas data security involves protective technological measures for the content. And of course, the consumer needs to take the relevant protective measures as well. On the other hand, there are inadequacies that can be seen here. That's why we have a major problem, for instance, with attacks of various kinds, because there is a lack of security amongst those people who use their end devices on the net and then transport the data into a cloud or to a different service, etc. So this is something that needs to be taken into account at the outset. So the question is, what am I prepared to do in order to increase the security of the data without taking measures that inhibit people's freedom? So this is a question that's not to be answered by the technological experts, but in the context of a social debate. What is it that we actually want to have? How can we weigh these protection targets against each other? And what's going to happen? What is a priority issue for us? What's more important to us than other things? And we have just had a very fascinating debate about the draft European regulation that is pending. So it needs to take into account protective rights, but also the economic issues involved. And this makes things very fascinating as regards the future. And because we can't ignore the fact that, of course, we need an attractive marketplace, and therefore protective measures need to be appropriate and should not go too far. But this very question, how can you strike a balance? That's what we need a broad-ranging debate on. This should be an individual decision here, and this should not be a corporate decision either, because I just want to act in the interest of my user, and therefore I need the authorization to carry out certain data protective measures, which of course may ultimately mean that you end up with a great deal of control over the use behavior on the part of the consumers. I think there's a considerable intention we have to address here.
Sparsamkeit.
Mr. Ramge, spare use of data versus or with data protection? Well, if you ask this question, it's going to be answered in a very good way by data protection officers. And Mr. Schaar said if you don't have data, it cannot be stolen either. So the system is safer the less data you have. But the problem is that this is not what it's about. The promise of the IT industry is to create added value from a whole plethora of data that improves our world. And this is what the informed consumers want to see fulfilled, this promise. There are restrictions. I'm quite aware that at the end of the day, we do not want to have all personal data floating freely around the internet. But the important follow-up question is, what are the opportunities that we are taking away from ourselves when we take the principle of spare use of data which we are discussing in an abstract way, but it is a predetermined principle in German data protection law. So if we adhere to this, because spare use of data quickly leads to poor data, and that is definitely not good, because if we don't have a lot of data, we cannot make use of the big amount of data that we have and extract the added value from this data that we need in order to achieve efficiencies in all societies that we have, including, for example, the health sector. Now, Mr. Niemitz said more data protection also translates into a economic advantage, and now you say data poverty can be a competitive disadvantage. How do you see that? Well, it's not only the question of how much data, it's also about the issue, where is this data generated, who controls this data, and what happens with this data, where are the interfaces. And this is something that is frequently overlooked. A company like the company that's organizing this event pursues the approach of monopolizing as much data as possible and to generate services from this and generate some findings on the basis of this data. And not all of these findings are made available to the world at large. Some of these findings are also used to make good business. And that's nothing illegal in a market society, but I could think of other models. We're talking about online server models, and this continues to be our world where smaller systems are linked to bigger systems, and these smaller systems, and that's the development that we're seeing take place at the moment, that these smaller systems become more intelligent as well. And why shouldn't we pursue this path? Not to make these systems the extended arm of the big brother, but the extended arm of the user, who him or herself controls what is being sent outside through this interface. And that brings us to the spare use of data, because this data is should not always be disclosed in a personal way, but in a way that helps to create value for society as a whole. So we are talking about technology, we are talking about organization, and we're talking about business models. And at all of these levels, we need to see some action. The huge amount of data that is created through digitization, because this is the process that we're right in the middle of, is something that doesn't only create benefits, it also creates some problems, because not all of these players are good, even though they declare that they're good all the time. There are some that don't even explain or declare that they're good. But we have to say there have to be some limits. There have to be some limits that can not only be legal, but also technical limits in this infinite world of the Internet. Mr. Hohlfelder, Mr. Niemitz spoke about a crisis of confidence. He said the companies are doing damage to themselves if they violate the rights of the users. What do you think about that? Well, confidence and trust is the most important thing. That's what one of the previous speakers also said. We don't really see this crisis of confidence. We need to work on maintaining this confidence, that we do everything possible, that the users continue to have confidence in our services. So I don't think it's a real crisis that we are currently seeing as the big challenge. I would just want to comment what Mr. Schaar just said. He basically defined a botnet. It's a system, not a server, that tries to shift information from one place to the other, and that is quite dangerous. We need to make sure that these systems that we come up with are designed in a secure way. And we can only do this if we understand, and this doesn't have to happen with personal data, this can happen with anonymous user data. We have to then analyze what's good and what's bad. But to a certain degree, this seems to be like the issue of terrorism. The state says, citizen, we want to protect you from terrorism. That's why we store all emails until infinity. So how real is this danger? Can you give us an example? I do not understand. You said this morning we want to store your search queries because it helps us to protect you in a better way. Okay, with the search queries, there are clear examples what we can use this data for to develop more innovation. But how do you protect me with this? I'll come to that in a second. Things like spell checks that Peter Dickman introduced, or the translate function, or the suggest function, these are all things that we do based on this data analysis. That's the economic benefit of the data that we need to explain, that we need to have in order to advance innovation. The other aspect is that the log data is analyzed in order to avoid web spam, i.e. websites that work with bad content and try to climb up in our ranking for mere economic purposes. And we can only do this if we analyze user interaction and find out that this is a real user who, based on a certain search term, wants to have this page, this result. And if you cannot do that, you do not end up with high-quality search results, but spam and other unwanted sites. Google did a study last week. 1,000 people were asked, internet users aged 14 and older, and if we look at the result, you see that it was quite surprising for me as well. When it comes to internet use, the most important thing was the question, and have a look at the blue bars, only the total number. The first thing you see, first ranked with a big distance, is security, then speed, and so on. And transparency is one of the last ranked answers. Are you surprised that people don't even attribute that much importance to the issue of transparency that is so frequently discussed? Yes, I am surprised by this, but I don't know how exactly the wording of this question was. Well, I think this is the original question. When I use the internet, the most important thing is da 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 da. Now, if we leave it at that, let's accept that this is the result and this is what people actually think. I nonetheless believe that we're in a certain paradoxon, because we are in a crisis of confidence. That's what a lot of studies on confidence and trust on the internet tell us. There's a study by DIFSI, the German Institute for Confidence and Security on the Internet. They carried out a respective study which comes to the result that we have a very clear crisis of confidence. That's the one thing. On the other hand, today's use of social media, of services that are quite popular among a broad range of people, seems to be contradicting this, and that's a paradoxon, a paradoxical situation that I'm seeing. So on the one hand, people want to have more security. It's a concrete result of many studies that state that 3/4 of all internet users want the state and industry to do more about security and data protection. That goes hand in hand, and you can see this when you look at this statistic here as well. But if you then probe a little bit deeper, you also find that many of the people who believe that they are digital natives and use the internet frequently, and that's 40% who see themselves like that. And those of us sitting here are the 19% digital immigrants, if I may put it that way. So with this group of people, you also see the fascinating phenomenon that the more subjectively you feel secure on the internet, the less you expect the state and industry to do something for the protection, because they think they're secure already. Now, if you look at the next slide, the pie chart, here the question was, for a secure use of the internet, the most important thing is, and you can see that the blue piece of the pie is the biggest, most frequent answer. They say it's the user, him or herself. State and companies are listed second and third ranked. Does that reflect when you've just said, because I interpret these figures to say people like to take things into their own hand because they have confidence in themselves. And this is similar to driving a car. When you ask car drivers what is the most important thing to avoid accidents, they're probably going to say the driver. Is that an argument against airbags? No. Is that an argument against fast, quick reaction rescue teams? No. So I think this is not surprising at all. But on the other hand, it might be a wrong perception. If you look at the latest book by Kahneman, Fast and Slow Thinking, it's on the bestseller list. I can only recommend this book. And translate that into data protection, you will find that there is the illusion of control here that is very widespread. There's the illusion that you yourself always have the control of things, and you have to deal with this because at the end of the day, this is not an argument against protection measures. Rather, the opposite is true. It's an argument in favor of a meaningful regulation. Can we have a look at the slide before again? Because I think the people who answered this question had the idea of somebody hacking their bank account when they were thinking of security. When I do online banking, the worst case is somebody hacking their account. That's why this is the first ranked. Transparency, I think people have rightly given up because the professional discussion of the past years has set a wrong priority. People do not want to know everything down to the last detail in data and IT topics. They want to have the feeling that the company that they're dealing with is a respectable and compliant company that is compliant with the existing data protection laws, but they're not that much interested in what's going on with this company. And this, on the other hand, means that security needs to become transparent. So security for most of the companies that work with data-driven business models will become something like a hygiene factor. Companies that don't have the confidence of the users, where users don't think that they are doing everything that is at the top-notch level of security and that the data is secure there, is a company that they don't want to do business with. And that's the first level of security. And the second perception is that they are good people, that they have a business model that is based on making money with data, but they don't believe that they're going to sell their data to some groups in Russia that end up hacking their accounts. So I think confidence, as Mr. Nimitz described, is a very central issue for all data-driven business models and will continue to be important, even more important in the future. But on the other hand, I do not believe that data protection of the European kind can create this type of confidence. It was quite interesting to see. I also was very satisfied when I saw that the European data protection seems to be something like the accelerator of European innovation. But this thesis is contradictory because it's about data. Because the data-driven industry in Europe is not in the very best place at the moment, even though we, historically speaking, have such a good data protection level. Do you want to contradict? I had a very interesting similar discussion in the United States with a Republican senator who told me the same thing. And he asked me, where was the iPhone invented? And I said, okay, it was invented in the United States. But it's definitely not a result of the lack of data protection. It's rather a result of a culture of innovation in certain sectors of industry. And if you ask where's the iPhone produced, you suddenly end up in an entirely different region. And that's a region that we don't want to have as a model society either. Well, but the framework of innovation is what Mr. Hohlfelder was referring to. This culture of innovation needs air to breathe. That's right, and that's why you need to differentiate, and that's why you also need to try things. But a company that is growing into the billions cannot argument with the fact we're a garage company, we're just trying and testing, and we don't have to adhere to laws. We have to, and I didn't mention a name. I did not mention a name. I just noticed this again and again, that individual companies just, test how far they can push the envelope. And we, as data protection officers in Europe, just published a new letter on the new data protection policy of Google. And we said, from our point of view, this is not a confidence-creating measure, even though it was sold as such. And that's why you might have to think about how these processes can be optimized. It was a reprimand. It was not a legal procedure, but a reprimand, your letter. Yes, it's an assessment of a process, and Mr. Nimitz pointed out that Google feels that it is not tied to European legislation, so it's nothing but a statement of our opinion, but this will be reviewed again, whether this leads to consequences. Maybe it's not necessary because the company is taking our reprimand seriously. Mr. Hohlfelder, when you get such a reprimand, when you read this reprimand, is that painful? We only received the letter today. I haven't read all the details, but it's self-evident that we adhere to European legislation. This is no question. And we're happy that there is constructive feedback and suggestions with regard to possible improvements, and we're going to seriously look at that and then react correspondingly. But that's all that I can say at the moment. We received the letter this morning, 11 a.m., and I was here throughout the entire day, so please excuse me for not knowing everything about the details of this letter. But with the next data dialogue, I think we will have seen one of the other progress that we've made. I wanted to introduce another idea, and I don't necessarily want to call it a failure of the market, but in the field of IT security and data protection, we see certain hints of a market failure. And this is first and foremost due to the fact that the consumers in their large numbers don't demand IT security and data protection. And this is not only referring to the protection of personal data. This is a big problem also for our entire IT infrastructures that become more and more dependent on protection. And this is why it's a big topic in the entire discussion around critical infrastructures and other structures where the state has a certain responsibility to protect these infrastructures. And I think from this responsibility to protect these infrastructures, we have to derive a responsibility to intervene if such a market failure is happening. And we need to do this in order to protect everybody, society as a whole, and the consumers in particular. And this is why a very tough data protection law is absolutely required. You can discuss this, and if industry offers self-regulation mechanisms that really lead to achieving a higher level of data protection, particularly when we're talking about highly complex and networked data and information, then the result is beneficial and can be seen as a result of the overall process. Let me give you an example. Smart metering. You can say there are different solutions for smart metering and there are different technical systems. Can you please explain what smart metering is? These are the so-called intelligent meters for electricity. It's an important element of the smart grids, where the different power providers and the consumers are interconnected and communicate with one another in a very abbreviated version. And the smart meters are one element of this. And these systems need to be secure on the one hand. They need to run safe. They need to be secure from an IT point of view so that there can be no hacking from the outside, because they are critical infrastructures. So they need to be systemically secure. And they need to be secure with regard to data protection, because it needs to be guaranteed that the private behavior which is reflected or which can be reflected in this meter, namely how the user uses electronic devices, all of this needs to be brought together. And I think this is possible. It's not easy, and there are always discussions in detail on how certain infrastructures should be designed and where and which parameter could be influenced how. But all in all, this example shows that it is possible. But the electricity market is a highly regulated market, so it's a lot easier to do this than in many other areas. But the electricity market, I think this discussion of the issue of data protection is very similar to the discussion of environmental protection in the 1960s and 70s. At that time, it was just normal to waste power, energy, and environmental resources the way we did. There were no filters, nothing. And with data protection, if you have a data spill, a breach of security, this is like, I don't know, the Exxon Valdez or crashing or the explosion of an oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico. Is that comparable? It's quite an interesting comparison. We know that, on the other hand, with the bad guys, there are structures that have become entirely professional. When we talk about cybersecurity, we're not talking about intelligent big companies with intelligent people like you, and on the other hand, some script kiddies. No, these are whole industrial infrastructures behind that as well, and people who work in a very efficient way with exploits and are familiar with all of the tricks of the trade to overcome the created security systems. In inverted brackets, we are seeing an arms race, so to say. And data security or cyber security needs to be geared at the question, how much money do I want to invest in order to create how much security? So I don't really know. And then every once in a while, there's a little accident. Sony, for example. And I think that this can definitely not be excluded 100%. Every once in a while, this will happen. But let me repeat, I think the question of data security is, from the point of view of the business model and business model using personal data, is a hygiene factor. If you cannot guarantee that if you fall into a data scandal again and again, you'll disappear from the market because no customer will give you their data. Another interesting topic for economic journalists, things become interesting when your interlocutor says, switch off your recorder. And I had a very nice situation with regard to smart metering when I talked to a big German company, a representative of the big German company who is more on the side of electronic processing of smart grids. And he said, you know what, we stopped our field trials in Germany completely. We rather do those in South Korea because we have faster development possibilities over there. The electronic health card, I know that different pressure groups only use the surfboard of data protection. They were involved in the electronic health card, and the important innovations in the health sector that we desperately need failed because allegedly data protection couldn't be guaranteed and data protection conformity would have been too difficult to achieve, and all of the participants at the end of the day said it's important to merge data in the health sector because this is beneficial for the individual patient, and it's also beneficial for analysis purposes in the health system and the research with regard to drugs and so on. So we cannot pretend, and that's what I heard in the previous presentation, that there is an automatic synergy between innovation and data protection. Historically speaking, or at least looking back on the past 15 years, the opposite was true, and there were one or two examples. IBM is doing a smarter comm system in Germany because this is where the toughest data protection legislation applies, and they sell it throughout Europe now. Well, this is one case where tough data protection legislation was beneficial for Germany as an economic location, but at the end of the day, the discussion, as we have seen it over the past 15 years, the discussion on data protection has definitely not led to advance innovation in digital business models in Germany. You can still say that's okay because data protection is more important to us, but you should not pretend that it were the other way around. Well, the example of the electronic health card is a little lopsided because we as data protection officers pursue other interests than those who just use data protection as a pretext. We all supported this project across all different lines, all of the other data protection officers as well. So I don't think that your diagnostics are right. This reluctance was motivated by interests outside of the realm of data protection that carried data protection on a billboard, and the actual interest was to create non-transparency. That's absolutely right. But using this now as an argument against data protection and saying somebody's using data protection as a pretext is not really fair. Mr. Hohlfelder, to come back to this comparison with the environmental protection, do you see yourself as an environmental as somebody who's protecting the environment of data to make it more secure? Absolutely, but I don't really agree with this term of hygiene factor. We've seen that we have done a lot more than what needs to be done in order to fulfill the definition of a hygiene factor. When we developed the Chrome browser, we introduced entirely new aspects with regard to data protection, and we attributed a lot of importance to this. This is the browser is the gateway for hackers, sandboxing, safe browsing. A lot of other technologies were newly introduced by us, and I think we've set new standards that were beneficial for the entire industry that now uses our browser as a role model, and it might be deemed a hygiene factor now. And you can gladly call us environmental protectors. I don't. I ask you whether you see yourself that way. We really see the ecosystem of the internet and want to make it safer for everybody, because if this collapses, I think we will no longer have a platform that we can live on. And this is not related to our own services. This is related to the microsystem internet or ecosystem internet. And let me give you another example. We have an HTTPS decryption for our email systems by default, and we're the only ones who are doing this. A lot of people complain about so many things and send their emails across the internet without decryption, and that is irresponsible. We have two systems in our Google accounts where you can ensure that somebody cannot log in from China and hijack your account. And if you're afraid of somebody cracking your bank account, then this frequently doesn't happen anymore because these people find out the password to your bank account. It happens because they hijack your email account, and based on the information contained in the emails, they send you a wrong password or do something else that enables them to access whatever they want. And we have to ensure that we become more than just a hygiene factor. We're investing a lot. We're driving the standards ahead. We're driving the technology ahead. And I think this is what our users want us to do, and this is what we're doing. You just mentioned Gmail. Google is looking at buzzwords of what people are writing on Gmail, and then there's personalized advertising. This is one of the business models, and not only Google is doing this, others are doing it as well. Also, our security agencies in Germany, the intelligence services in 2010 checked more than 38 million emails in Germany for the buzzword bomb. I took this from documents of the federal parliament. And Mr. Welch, isn't that a double moral to always point the finger at Google and Facebook and at the same time use the same means? I don't think so. What's happening here is subject to rule of law and is part of a law passed in the Federal Republic of Germany, and we have parliamentary structures. This was a query by a representative of the left party who wanted to find out whether you were doing that, and he was the one who disclosed it. Well, you can call it disclosed, but I mean, this is the advantage of our parliamentary democracy, namely that Parliament is scrutinizing the executive, and there is the right to ask question, and that's not how things are disclosed. It's a regular parliamentary process that you discuss certain things, but it's accessible, and we can openly talk about these things today. And in other countries, you possibly can't do that. So I'm not worried at all that there could be abuse. I think we're in a very good position in this respect, and who scrutinizes what? I'm not familiar with this report. Mr. Schaar, let me ask you, how many people do you have to control the controllers? Well, all in all, we have 90 employees, of which only a small group controls the intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies, because we have a broad range of tasks. We also have the state data protection officers, but I don't want to, do away with your question. You're absolutely right. You cannot say state are the good guys and the companies are the bad guys. That's wrong, and I have, I believe, never ever expressed it that way. I think we have made the decision in society to follow the idea of the social market economy, where we have certain fundamental rights that also need to be protected, and so we also have to ask ourselves, what is the state doing? How does the state access data that is stored by companies and inside of companies? And we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean with regard to sparse use of data, storage, with regard to the possibility of the state as the exclusive party to access this data? That's something that we need to look at. Some companies are required to store data so that only the state can access this data, and I think this is also questionable. Or if you look at an act that has been enforced in the United States for almost 10 years, and I'm not referring to the Patriot Act, but the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It's not really well known here, but without any approval of a judge, this enables the authorities to access foreign communication. I try to find out what foreign communication means, and this is not just a communication from the United States abroad, but also communication via servers that are located in the United States. Now, it would be quite nice for you to say, how frequently do U.S. citizens use this information? Is this act, can this act be used for cloud services? Maybe you can say something about this. We have a transparency report that does exactly that and tries to disclose exactly that as far as we're allowed to do that. In this report, you can see which states are the FISA issues included in that. And how's Germany ranking? Germany is ranking quite high. High with regard to what? Many queries. For example, taking content off. But this is due to the fact that we have certain contents on the internet that we want to have taken off because we no longer want to have it there. But as far as I know, and I'm not an expert in this field, FISA is not a state query on certain data. It's the possibility of opening up access to this data. And we can provide you with this information. We can give you this information. I would just be interested in getting it, yes, because this would also have an impact on the assessment of how secure the data that I give you is, because I'm also giving you a lot of my data. That's why we've included it. It's another aspect regarding the security of my data. Which state authorities, which countries access this data? This is a very important aspect.
I would say that we take some questions from the audience now. I'm sure there will be people who want to put questions to the panelists. If you'd like to introduce yourself very briefly. Ulrich Hottelet is my name. I'd like to come back to the issue of data protection at European level. The critical remarks were made of Google today. Mr. Schaar has issued a press statement in this respect. So I would like to find out a bit more about this. Now, I read that about the linking of the data from the various Google services. Although the debate about Google and data protection has not been dealt with in that much detail from my point of view. So I'd like to hear from Mr. Schaar. What would you see as being the three most critical uses of data? Well, from my point of view, of course, there's a change of the business model or the further development of the business model that was undertaken by means of the integration of certain means of evaluation or the merging or blending of different services, that is. Now, if I misconstrued this, I stand to be corrected. Now, before this new data protection policy was introduced, there was a service and a user-related evaluation of information of the individual user. Gmail services were evaluated in a different way to the search queries. As a result of this new data protection policy, that was what was justified, or it was a core element of the fact that these uses derived from the various services and were analyzed and evaluated accordingly with respect to certain areas of application by Google as a company. We're talking about the further development services, of course, but it's also a question of finding out what interests the individuals have so that advertisements can be placed accordingly. I think that's the main thrust of the criticism. The second aspect concerns the transparency of this declaration, where the French Data Protection Office reviewed things in conjunction with us and came to the conclusion that the transparency suffered from the considerable compromission of the data that made it insufficient, not necessarily inferior to the situation that applied beforehand, where the data policy was distributed more broadly and appeared slightly inconsistent. But now it's so general. So if you look at this relatively short declaration, you can see that the user is not informed to any great extent as to what happens with the data he's provided. That's the question of its introduction, which was suboptimal in our respect. Certain data protection authorities were consulted. I don't want to go into any more detail on this here at the present moment in time. We were not satisfied at any rate, if I can put it that way. Mr. Horfeld, do you want to respond? Perhaps I can say something about the first comment that was made there. So, indeed, there's not really a great deal that actually happened as respect to silos. Only two services was integrated. YouTube was a company that Google acquired and had its own policy before that. So the other services were as they were beforehand. And so there's not really a great deal that actually changed. So I think we have to take a look and make sure that we have things properly debated. Any other questions? I mentioned three. The way, or the method of its introduction of this new data policy. And these were the points that we criticized. Of course, we looked at Google Street View, we looked at Wi-Fi scanning, and discussed that. I don't want to go into all that here. But let me just home in on one point. It's not a question of good or evil, but of the economic aspects involved. Now, this data-driven business, these models, Google has been very successful. Facebook's also successful, perhaps not quite as successful as Google, but successful nonetheless, and other companies are involved too. This all rests on the fact that personal data are collated and analyzed accordingly. Now, this is a trend which ultimately means that more and more data are collected in order to achieve the required economic effect to come up with the desired business results. Now, ultimately, this is development which runs very much counter to the interests of data privacy and security. And this is the core dilemma with which we have to get to grips. Data protection legislation cannot prevent this happening. Ultimately, it doesn't want to do so, because ultimately we're talking about limitations or restrictions of this potential threat. That's the crux, actually. Any further questions from the audience? Yes, to my left. Mr. Schaar, I'd like to put a question to you, picking up on the 37 million private mails going back to the year 2010 that were reviewed by the government authorities. 37 million scores, so there were many more emails that were investigated, not just for the word bomb, but for other terms as well. We haven't talked about the Patriot Act, but about other things in the United States. I'm sure there will be nobody in the world who would not see such developments critically. But what would you say about what the intelligence service in Germany is doing? I haven't heard any criticism from your side. So in general, my feeling is that nobody's really upset about this. Well, this specific case was the subject of a parliamentary control inquiry. And the G10 committee is a very secret body, met, had an explanation given to it, and obviously there was a plausible explanation that was given to this body, or as the spokesman of all the parliamentary groups were no longer critical in remarks after meeting had taken place. I didn't have any criticism myself, at least, so essentially all I saw was the public statement, and derived from that that it was a question of spams that were being analysed and evaluated, so I can't follow any greater detail in that respect. There is a strategic telephone monitoring service that was introduced, if I remember correctly, at the end of the 1980s, using such buzzwords. It was very controversial at that time. It was a subject of review by the Federal Constitutional Court. And in contrast to targeted telephonic monitoring, the situation is that you look for certain terms and not for individual communication in order. Well, basically, it's similar to the way that Google works. On the basis of certain constellations or repetitions, you may end up with certain findings. For instance, the preparation of a military attack, for instance. Now, that's the concept, that's the notion. And what they say is that we're not interested in the individual mail. No, what we are interested in is the overall constellation as such. And that's the point of approach. I would see this critically because, of course, the individual mail is also examined, and after you've been through various filters, of course, you will end up with a service looking at the mails as such. But the intervention is not the same as a targeted scrutiny. I see this critically. We're trying to reverse this to a certain extent in legislative terms, but in my position, I do not have any review competence with respect to these monitoring measures. I don't want to be misconstrued here. For me, the United States is a constitutional country, and therefore, for me, it is the case that other countries are intervening in a massive way in people's private sphere. Germany is not among those countries, let me just stress that. So this is, again, is something that should not be lost sight of. Well, if there are no further questions, I'll just look around the hall. I don't see anybody like to put any questions to you. I'd like then to ask you, in turn, to say to us how you address the issue of data economy, data security. Do you use filters? How do you, as far as is realistically possible, to conduct an everyday check of your personal data? Perhaps you'd like to begin. Well, I opt for certain services and against other services and don't use them. So this is a personal assessment of opportunities and risks that I have. which I could recommend to everybody else too. You've got to examine what advantages you expect to get from a certain service, and we've got, of course, you've got to think about the risks that you're going to entertain, and if you come up with an appropriate balance, there's no reason not to proceed accordingly. Now, at the technical level, all I can do basically is to advise people to use the technical facilities that are available, updating services, which of course are available in the context of operating services. Safe search filter should be used. And if you do that, you've really done quite a lot, really. Use these 80% measure, put it that way, you get a very, very long way in protecting yourself against targeted attacks. There is always a residual risk, of course. The alternative would, of course, is switch off the light, of course, which nobody wants to do anyway. So that basically will be my advice, and that's the personal approach that I adopt, taking conscious decisions and trying to adhere to your principles. Dr. Ohlfelder. Well, I do the following. I use the technology used by the BSI, including the browser Chrome. Of course, there are other aspects to be taken into account here. And above all, use the two-way identification. So I live in a cloud. Lots of my data are up there in a cloud. I place my faith in the security technologies and to use that on my private account as well. We have to do that on a corporate account anyway. But I use this two-way identification on my private account as well, which I would also recommend to everybody, because there are many cases amongst my friends and acquaintances where accounts have been taken over and very, very nasty things have happened. And you ought to think basically about whether you just use a simple password. It's not just a question of the data being valuable. What can you do if you are the owner of that account? So that my recommendations: use a safe account and two-way identification. My GMX account was hacked once in the past. A few hours later, no further mails could be sent from my account. That's 6 months ago, and hitherto I've not succeeded in removing that ban, which isn't that bad because I have other sources I can draw on. But there are companies to which I would entrust my data, for instance, on collaboration platforms where you can write books. So my last book was composed using Google Docs because I wrote the book with two co-authors, and that worked very smoothly. And apart from that, I think that I'm not really up to date in technical terms, although I can't compare myself with what's been said so far. So I'll try to introduce the various improvements this evening. Mr. Schaar, well, I think I'm quite safe in corporate terms, and I'm in the top 2/3 in private terms. I take various measures to make abuse unlikely. But of course, it's certainly not the case that I can be 100% certain. But what's important to me too is that I should pursue a maxim that I learned from economic realm: don't put all your eggs in one basket. Even though, of course, the egg merchant would like to see that happen. This is something you also should apply to your data too. That you could come at different ways and means of operating, not just use one provider, but to spread things around a bit. And as regards what you entrust to various services or should make public, well, you should go through the world with your eyes wide open. I will provide certain information to the cloud, and as regards emails, that is in fact the case, because I don't really have any alternatives. But as regards other information, I would be much more reticent. And I am indeed reticent. And as regards the public sphere, of course, well, everybody should know themselves what they're going to reveal. I'm very sparing as regards private information and its availability. But of course, I do use or try various things out, what's available in terms of innovations, for the simple reason that I want to keep up with developments, keep in touch with others. I don't know whether the other data security officers who proceed along the same lines, perhaps they do that using a pseudonym. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Thank you very much to our panelists. I should like to review what we've experienced in the course of the day, because I should like to point out that we don't want to go home with this paranoid feeling that the data are only poor. I learned this morning that without data, science is impossible, and that basically data are not worth anything per se if they're not used. The question is, for what purpose they're being used? We must be able to use the data so that they provide us with a benefit or advantage. We heard about Open Berlin and Free Space Berlin people. We learned from them that you cannot just secure data paths, but also cycle paths, for instance, by changing policy, and provide people with information who can use them accordingly, so data to be exploited. And we have also learned that a large number of people are beginning themselves to build their own data protection tools. Google's hackathon showed that. The 3 winners of the Chrome Extensions Prize. So that is user-driven. And last but not least, we learned this afternoon that it's not the task of one institution alone, or one company alone, or one legislator, but that basically we need a whole canon of the varying bodies who must pool their efforts to address this mammoth task of the future. So I think everybody's agreed that there's no one body can do this all on its own. So we need cooperation. So thank you very much for being with us today. There are a few drinks available downstairs. You can engage in networking there. And see you again next year.